Currently, Eli Lilly is buried in the mausoleum back kind of behind the trees. This is his grandson, Eli Lilly, who died in 1977. Again, that's the guy we voted the greatest Hoosier of the 20th century, probably because he was the most influential in starting the Lilly Foundation. And naturally, we appreciate that, so we voted him the greatest Hoosier. I want to talk briefly before we talk a little bit about some kind of innocent dirt on the Lilly family. We don't get too dirty on the Lillys. There's an obelisk, now you can't see it, but you see the statue? The statue, I mean the monument to the right of the statue is an obelisk, which is one of those, like this thing, for the Taggart family. And Taggarts were an important political family, 100 years ago or so. He had been a mayor, actually had been born in Ireland and made his way up until he was like the leading political figure, though not necessarily in office, but behind the scenes political figure, actually in Indiana. And then he was the national chairman of the Democratic Party in the early 1900s, and also owned French Lick Hotel when it was in its prime, back when gambling was illegal, but everybody gambled there. And supposedly he rides through the hotel of the halls of the hotel on his horse now. So now, since they remodeled it, I know he may have trouble doing that. But anyway, very popular man. In 1898, his daughter, who was in college at the time, got together with some friends, and they decided to take a boat ride from Louisville, where they were in college, down through Louisiana, New Orleans, and then across the bay to Florida someplace. They got to Florida. There'd been some trouble with the boat. They were in New Orleans on New Year's Day. Then they took off, and the families of all these girls, there's 6 or 7 girls on this boat. All of a sudden, all the letters that they were writing from home as the steady stream stopped. So they started to kind of worry. Tom Taggart, who was the mayor of Indianapolis at the time, went down to New Orleans to try to find out what was going on. And eventually they found, on January 18th, as some fishermen were dragging their nets out in the harbor of the Delta, trying to catch fish, basically, but they pulled up 2 trunks, and one of them carried the clothes of Florence Taggart. He stayed there, did some more investigation. I think they found some parts of the boat, and he pretty much realized that something had happened to the boat. It had sunk, and apparently nobody had survived. If they had made it to the shore, it was still so wild and stuff back then that he was confident that nobody had survived. So he came back home. Not too happy about it, but came back home, settled that was what had happened. Well, his wife, who had not been down there and seen all those things, was still upset that they didn't have a body, naturally. And so he finally decided, well, I'll take she and her sister down with me to Louisiana. We'll go back to New Orleans. I'll show them all this stuff, and maybe they'll at least get a little bit of peace about what's happened, and some closure, I guess is the word they usually say. Well, when they got down to New Orleans, they got word that a party that had been out on some island, on a small strip of land named Grand Gosier Island, had come across the body. And the body had been covered by sand except for one hand, and that was what allowed it to be discovered. The Taggarts made their way down and saw the body, and it was indeed Florence, the daughter. This is what Tom Taggart had to say about seeing his daughter's body. And this is 2 or 3 months after she had died. The teeth and mouth were as perfect and natural as mine are today. The conditions of the remains simply astounded me. The discovery is a relief provided for the family only by Providence. The Almighty alone could have preserved this body of all those lost in the manner in which it was saved. Washed by the Gulf waves to the only spot where it could be safe, and found by a fisherman who might be one of half a dozen to visit the sand strip in a year, we thank the Almighty for its deliverance. None of the girls were found. The other girls, eventually somebody did find the body of the captain of the boat, but nobody else was found. And on May 18th, her body was brought back here and buried up there next to that obelisk up there with the other family members. Okay, as far as the lilies go, let's come down here just a little bit. Okay, you guys probably want to get out that way. I'm standing behind the grave of Josiah K. Lilly, who is the son of the Colonel Eli Lilly who founded the company, and then the father of that Eli Lilly and another Josiah K. Lilly Jr. who's buried a little further back up the hill. That Josiah K. Lilly Jr. would be this guy's son, is the father of the Ruth Lilly, who is still alive and up into her 90s. She owns the property that's behind the Lilly Mausoleum where nobody is currently buried, and you can maybe still see a little bit of open space up there. So she's still alive. She's this guy's granddaughter. But at any rate, we're just briefly going to talk a little bit about the lilies. I think it's something that's a little more humorous than anything else, if you find it humorous. This is Josiah Lilly. He fell in love with his second cousin, whose last name was Ridgely, but she'd been named after one of their common ancestors, so that her first name was Lily. And so, they get married when they're about 20, 21, and now she's Lily. She lives a pretty full life, dies eventually in her 60s from pernicious and anemia. I think while the Lillies were working, the company was working on a cure for that, or at least a drug for it. Then 14 months later, he married a lady who was the sister of his son Eli's second wife. I don't know what, if that makes him his own grandpa or what, but you'll notice her name is Lila. So he's buried here between his two wives, Lily, and Lila Lilly. So, and that's about as much dirt as I could find on the wall. You'll notice, though, those of you that are over here, I've read that about 40% of all the burials all across the United States in the 1800s would have been children under the age of 6. And that did not just affect, poor people. It affected everybody, because medical care just wasn't that good back then. And here we have two graves that are actually the sons of the grandson Eli Lilly, buried over there. So they're this guy's grandchildren. But they had Colonel Eli Lilly had started the company. He didn't have the foresight to name his son Eli Jr., so he named him Josiah. But Josiah named one of his sons Eli, and who was going to be, the next president of the company. We want to keep this company in the family, and so we want to have Eli is running the company. So Eli had a son, named him Eli. We'll do the first one here. Lived 1 month, June 7th to July 7th, 1908. 2 years later, he has a second son. What do you think he names the second son? Eli. That son only lived 6 months, so whether you were poor or wealthy, infant mortality was bigger back then. So.
What do they do underneath the obliques that you described? Is that just is there anything under it, or is it just?
It's just about a foundation that's probably 10 feet deep and 10 feet square. But as far as the burials are in front of these monuments here.
Do you know what that tree is?
That's a ginkgo tree. Yeah. We have a tree map available. I have a few in my car maybe, but most of what we're walking through today was actually farmland by the time the cemetery was established. And so a lot of the trees that are here, for the most part, were planted after 1864. And as a result, the guy who managed the cemetery is actually buried back that way, just a little bit, named Frederick Chislett, planted a wide variety of trees, including trees that aren't native to Indiana. And we have on this tree map 100 different species of trees marked. And that happens, that's not one of the ones officially on the map, but that is a ginkgo tree. Okay. You guys can stay on the road. I'll stand by this monument. And I don't know if everybody can read it because it's getting kind of dark under the tree, but this is Kurt Vonnegut's parents right here, Kurt and Edith Vonnegut. This is Kurt's maternal grandparents. His maternal grandparents are actually the Liebers who are behind the Lily obelisk.